I need to tell you this before I lose my nerve, before I start sanding the edges off what happened and pretend it was something smaller, something explainable. A man is missing because of me, maybe dead, maybe worse. And every time I close my eyes, I see the water folding back over him like a curtain being drawn. You'll want to know what I saw out there that night, alone on the lake, and I will tell you. But understand this first. I didn't go there looking for anything except quiet. I didn't believe in monsters. I still don't. At least not the kind with fur and teeth and hands shaped almost like ours. But something came out of that water. Something that stood on two legs and breathed like a drowning animal, learning how to live again. And I watched it. I watched it rise. If I had packed up sooner, if I had ignored the splashing, if I had not stayed for one more cast, maybe none of this would have happened. That's the part that keeps me awake. Not the creature, the choice. It always begins with a small choice. I'd been fishing alone for 3 weeks straight after Mara left. The lake sat 15 miles from town, fed by a narrow river that slid through cattails and mud before widening into that cold, dark basin. Early October, the air thin and metallic, the kind of evening where the sky bruises purple before it gives up the sun. I liked the way the dock creaked under my boots, the way the water slapped wood in slow, patient rhythms. It felt honest, cleaner than the apartment with its empty closet and her toothbrush still leaning in the cup. I told myself I was healing, that solitude was medicine. The first 2 weeks were quiet enough to believe that lie. I would set up near the southern bend, where the drop-off ran steep, bait my line, and listen. Crickets sawing at the dark, wind threading through pine needles. Once in a while a fish would break the surface with a neat, polite ripple. Nothing dramatic, nothing that didn't belong. That third week, though, the lake felt different. I noticed it the moment I stepped out of my truck. No birds, not even the usual gulls that scavenged near the shallows. The air carried a smell I couldn't place, not rot exactly, but something thick and animal. Wet hide left too long in a closed room. I remember laughing to myself, saying out loud, "You're spooking yourself now," as if the trees could hear me. That was the last time I heard my own voice without it shaking. I set my chair at the edge of the dock and cast out. The line hissed through the guides, landed with a soft plop. The water swallowed it without complaint. I waited. Minutes passed. The sun slid lower. A chill crept under my jacket and settled along my spine. Then I heard it. Not a splash, not at first, more like a heavy exhale, a wet, dragging breath coming from somewhere beyond the reeds. I held still, convinced it was a deer wading too deep, or maybe a beaver hauling driftwood. The sound came again, closer, followed by a slow churn of water against mud. I told myself to stand, to pack up. Instead, I leaned forward. Curiosity is an ugly thing. It dresses itself as courage. The reeds parted, just a little. I saw the top of something dark beneath the surface, moving against the current instead of with it. Too large for a dog, too deliberate for a floating log. The water around it trembled. My line went slack. I hadn't noticed the fish steal my bait. I wasn't watching the line anymore. The shape rose inch by inch, as if climbing invisible steps. First a slick curve that might have been a shoulder, then a hand. That's when my body understood before my mind did. It was a hand, long fingers, webbed with dripping weeds, knuckles pale beneath stretched skin. It gripped the mud at the bank and pulled. The head broke the surface next, fur plastered tight to a narrow skull, ears pinned back, not round like a bear's, but pointed, alert. Water poured from its muzzle in steady streams. I could see teeth even before it opened its mouth fully, see them through the thin skin of its lips. It did not roar. It did not howl. It simply breathed. Each inhale rattled. Each exhale steamed in the cooling air. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it looked exhausted, as if the climb from the lake had cost it something immense. I should have run then. I did not. I watched as it dragged the rest of itself free. The torso was wrong, too long, ribs visible under dark fur that clung like oil. Its legs unfolded awkwardly, bending at angles that made my own knees ache in sympathy. When it stood upright, it was taller than me by at least a head. Water streamed off it, pattering onto leaves in a steady rain. The smell hit me fully then. Copper and wet dog, and something sour beneath it. My stomach turned. It lifted its head and looked straight at me, not in surprise, not in confusion, in recognition. That is what I cannot shake. There was awareness in its eyes, a tired, calculating awareness. We held each other's gaze across maybe 20 yards of darkening shore. I do not know how long we stayed like that. Time thinned out, stretched fragile. The dock groaned under my shifting weight. The sound snapped something in the air between us. Its ears twitched. Slowly, almost gently, it took a step toward the waterline, not toward me, but parallel, as if testing the ground. I felt my throat close. My legs refused to obey. I whispered, "Go back." I don't know why I said that. It tilted its head, a small motion, questioning. Then it lowered itself onto all fours with a fluidity that made my skin crawl, and moved along the bank, keeping me in its peripheral gaze. It did not charge. It did not retreat. It paced, measuring. I fumbled for my phone without looking away, fingers clumsy. No signal. Of course not. The screen's faint glow seemed too bright in that growing dark. When I looked up again, it was closer, 10 yards now. Close enough to see scars along its flank, pale lines crossing fur. Close enough to hear the soft click of its claws against stones. I stood then. The chair tipped behind me and crashed onto the dock. The sound cracked through the evening like a gunshot. The creature flinched, lips peeling back just enough to show more teeth. A low sound vibrated from its chest. Not a growl, something deeper. A warning, maybe, or a question. I took one step back. The dock wobbled. My heel slipped on damp wood. I windmilled, caught myself on the railing. When I looked again, it was gone, vanished. The shoreline lay empty, except for reeds swaying in slow apology. I stayed frozen for a full minute, maybe more, scanning the water. Nothing. No ripples, no breath. Just the lake settling into its old rhythms, as if it had never been disturbed. I told myself I had imagined it. Stress, grief, isolation twisting shadows into shapes. I packed up in jerking motions and left without reeling in my line. Joked that I was going feral after the breakup. I went back the next evening despite every instinct advising otherwise. That is the part that condemns me. I went back because I needed to know if it had been real. The lake greeted me with the same brittle silence. The smell lingered, faint but undeniable. I sat up in the same spot, hands shaking only a little. I told myself I would stay until sunset and leave if nothing happened. The sky dimmed. My line remained untouched. Then, just as the first star blinked into view, I heard footsteps behind me on the gravel path. Relief flooded me so fast my knees buckled. "Hey," a voice called softly. It was Tom from the bait shop. I hadn't even known he fished out there. He walked into the clearing with a lazy grin, carrying his own rod. "Didn't think I'd see you here again," he said. I opened my mouth to warn him, to say something about the reeds, about the thing I'd seen, but the words tangled in my throat. He laughed at my expression. "You look like you saw a ghost," I almost told him. Instead, I shrugged. "Just tired." We fished side by side in uneasy quiet. The presence of another human steadied me. I started to believe I had conjured the previous night from loneliness. The lake lay flat and obedient. An hour passed. Tom caught a small bass and released it with a flourish. "See," he said, "nothing out here but fish." The water behind him bulged. I saw it before he did. A dome rising just beneath the surface, silent and immense. My heart slammed so hard it hurt. "Tom," I said, but it came out a whisper. He turned, smiling, and that was when the surface split. It erupted upward in a column of spray and black fur. The creature surged out of the lake not 20 feet from us, water exploding in all directions. Tom stumbled back, shouting something I couldn't understand. The Dogman, because that is the only word that fits, however childish it sounds, landed in the shallows on 2 feet, then dropped forward with terrifying speed. I saw its jaws open. I saw Tom's face drain of color. I should have grabbed him. I should have run toward him instead of away. The dock shook as I bolted. Behind me came a single scream, cut short by a wet, choking sound. I reached the truck without looking back. That is the moment that defines me. Not what I saw, what I chose. I drove. I drove until the lake was miles behind me, and my hands had gone numb on the wheel. I told the police that Tom had slipped, that he must have fallen in. They dragged the lake for 2 days. They found nothing but his tackle box drifting near the reeds. No blood, no body. The town whispers now, about the currents, about old sinkholes beneath the lake. I nod along. I let them believe it was an accident, but I know what came out of that water. I know it watched me the first night and decided something. And sometimes late, when the pipes in my apartment groan and the air smells faintly of copper, I hear that same wet, dragging breath just beyond my door, patient as the tide, waiting for me to choose again. I told myself I would never go back, and for a while I meant it. The night Tom disappeared, I locked every window in my apartment and wedged a chair beneath the front door knob like a child afraid of burglars. I slept with the lights on, or tried to. Each time I drifted close to unconsciousness, I felt water creeping up my legs, cold and heavy, and I would jolt awake, gasping, certain I heard claws scraping along tile. Nothing was ever there, just the hum of the refrigerator, the old building settling, my own pulse knocking inside my skull. The police came by twice more that week. They asked gentle questions at first, then sharper ones. When was the last time I saw him? Did he seem depressed? Had he been drinking? I answered carefully. I kept my voice steady. I did not mention fur or teeth, or the way the lake had opened like a mouth. They would have written me off as unstable. And maybe I was. Grief does strange things. Guilt does worse. I avoided the bait shop. It felt obscene to step inside, to see the rack where Tom used to lean and talk about lures like they were precious artifacts. His sister had taped a missing poster to the window. The photo showed him mid-laugh, head thrown back, sunlight catching in his beard. I stood there longer than I should have. I kept thinking about the way his scream had cut off. Not faded, not trailed away. Cut, like a line snapped under tension. That sound plays on a loop behind my thoughts. You would think fear would be the strongest memory. It isn't. It's the silence afterward. The silence where a man used to be. I began to notice small things around town. Stray dogs vanishing, a pair of hikers reporting something large moving along the riverbank at dusk. The stories were half-formed, embarrassed, as if the tellers expected to be laughed at. I listened too closely. I started carrying a pocket knife everywhere, though I knew it would be useless against something that size. The smell followed me. That is what convinced me it wasn't just in my head. Some evenings, walking to my truck after work, I would catch a faint trace of wet hide and metal in the air, even miles from the lake. It would vanish as quickly as it came. Once in the grocery store, I froze near the meat counter, because for a second I thought I heard that low, chest-deep vibration again. I turned too fast and knocked over a display of canned beans. People stared. I laughed it off. "Jumped at nothing," I said. But I wasn't jumping at nothing. I was jumping at memory. 3 weeks after Tom disappeared, they called off the search. Officially, a presumed drowning. The lake had a reputation for hidden drop-offs and sudden cold pockets. It was plausible. Plausible is a comforting word. It lets everyone go home. I tried to follow their example. I tried to fold the memory into something manageable. I even told myself a version where what I saw that night was a bear distorted by panic and poor light. Bears can stand upright. Bears can swim. Bears can kill. But bears do not look at you the way that thing looked at me. There was comprehension there, a weighing. I felt measured and spared. That thought burrowed into me. Spared? Why? The question grew teeth of its own. I started waking at exactly 3:17 a.m. every night. I don't know why that time. The clock glowed red in the dark like a small accusation. Each time I woke, I felt the same certainty. Something was outside. Not scratching, not knocking, just present. I would lie still and listen to the building breathe. Once, I heard a faint drip from the hallway. Slow, rhythmic, as if water were falling onto linoleum. I opened my door before I could stop myself. The hallway was empty, dry. But the air felt colder there than in my apartment, and for a moment I had the dizzying impression of depth, like if I stepped forward I might sink ankle-deep into black water. I shut the door and did not sleep again that night. You might think this is where I lose my grip entirely, that I spiral into paranoia. I considered that possibility. I even scheduled an appointment with a therapist. I sat in her office, hands knotted together, and tried to explain the lake without sounding unhinged. I left out the Dogman. I spoke in metaphors. She nodded and said trauma can manifest as sensory flashbacks, that guilt seeks punishment, that the mind sometimes invents monsters to give shape to grief. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But then she asked, gently, why I had run. And I had no answer that didn't make me smaller. I stopped going after 2 sessions. The 4th week after the incident, a fisherman found something near the northern shore. Not a body, a boot. Tom's. The police showed it to me for confirmation. The leather was warped and waterlogged, laces torn. There were marks along the sole, deep grooves, almost parallel, as if something had gripped it hard. I traced them with my thumb and felt a tremor move through me. The officer said it was probably rocks. I nodded. Plausible. Always plausible. That night the smell was stronger than ever in my apartment. Not faint, not imagined, thick enough to taste. I moved from room to room, checking windows, vents, drains. When I reached the bathroom, I noticed water pooled around the base of the tub, a thin line of it creeping outward across tile. I stared at it for a long time before kneeling down. It was cold, fresh. I touched the faucet, dry. The drain gurgled softly, though I hadn't used it. I pressed my ear to the porcelain and listened. For a second there was nothing. Then, far below, a muted shifting sound, like something adjusting its weight in a confined space. I jerked back so fast I cracked my head on the sink. The drain went silent, completely silent. I stuffed a towel into it and sat on the bathroom floor until dawn, back against the door, knife in my hand. I did not call anyone. What would I say? There's something in my pipes? Even now I can hear how it sounds. I returned to the lake on the 5th week. I didn't tell anyone. I drove out at noon, when the sun was high and the world felt less fragile. I told myself I was going for closure, for proof. Maybe I wanted it to be empty. Maybe I wanted to see the shore untouched and feel foolish. The lake looked ordinary, innocent. Children splashed near the public dock on the far side. A couple picnicked beneath the pines. I parked at my usual spot and walked down to the southern bend. The reeds swayed in a light breeze. No smell, no silence. Birds called from the trees. I felt almost embarrassed standing there with my pounding heart. I stepped closer to the water's edge and scanned the mud. There were prints, large, deeply pressed, not hoofed, not pawed exactly either. The front portion elongated, the back narrower, like a distorted human foot. They led from the water into the brush. My throat tightened. I crouched and placed my hand beside one. My fingers barely spanned half its length. It was real, tangible, not a hallucination. As I stood, I felt that same prickling awareness along my neck, the sense of being observed. Slowly, deliberately, I turned toward the tree line. At first I saw nothing but shadow. Then I noticed how one shadow was wrong. Too tall, too still. It stood between two pines, half obscured, fur dry now, clinging close to its frame. Its head tilted slightly, as if studying me. There was no aggression in its posture, no immediate threat, just that unbearable attention. My mouth went dry. I did not move. Neither did it. We held that distance like a fragile thread. I wanted to shout, to demand why. Instead, I heard myself say, barely audible, "What do you want?" The wind carried the words away. It blinked, slow, human. Then it stepped back, vanishing into deeper shadow with a quiet that defied its size. I stood there long after it disappeared, my heart hammering against bone. It could have taken me then. It chose not to. Again. And as I walked back to my truck, I understood something that hollowed me out from the inside. It wasn't hunting blindly. It was coming closer. Not just to the shore, to me. And I had no idea what would happen when it finally decided the waiting was over. I should have left town after that. That would have been the sane thing. Pack a bag, quit my job, disappear somewhere dry and landlocked where lakes were only pictures in waiting rooms. Instead, I stayed. I told myself I needed to understand it, that if it was coming closer to me, then distance wouldn't matter anyway. That's the lie I wrapped around my fear so I could function. The truth is uglier. Part of me wanted to see it again, not out of bravery, out of obsession. When something chooses you, even by accident, it carves a shape in your mind that nothing else quite fits. The days after I saw it standing between the pines, stretched thin and brittle. I went to work. I nodded at customers. I answered emails. But everything felt staged, like I was acting in a life that no longer belonged to me. Every reflective surface became a threat. The darkened window of my office after sunset, the black screen of my phone. I kept expecting to see a second shape behind my shoulder. I started cataloging details from memory, replaying each encounter in painful clarity. The first night, exhaustion in its posture, water streaming from fur, the way it tested the ground before committing its weight. The second night, speed, violence, the explosive breach from the lake, the daylight sighting, restraint, observation, the tilt of its head when I spoke. Those were not random behaviors. They suggested pattern, intention. I hated that word. Intention meant thought, and thought meant choice. I drove back to the lake 3 more times that week, always during the day, always armed with nothing more than my useless knife and a courage that felt increasingly performative. Each visit I found new impressions in the mud, some fresher than others. Once, I found the carcass of a deer half submerged near the northern shore. It had been opened with precision, ribs parted cleanly, organs removed, not torn apart in frenzy, but dissected with something close to deliberation. The smell around it was overwhelming, metallic and sweet and sour all at once. I gagged and stumbled back. Flies clouded the air, but even they seemed hesitant to settle too long. I scanned the tree line, certain I was being watched. Nothing moved. The surface of the lake lay flat, reflecting a sky too blue to trust. I began noticing changes in the water itself. That sounds insane, I know. But listen. The lake had always been clear enough near the edges that you could see stones beneath the surface. Now there were darker swaths stretching outward from the southern bend, like ink slowly diffusing. At first I thought it was algae, seasonal turnover, but the discoloration pulsed subtly, as if stirred from below. Once, kneeling at the dock, I dipped my fingers in and felt a current moving against the wind, a steady inward pull, faint but undeniable. I jerked my hand back as if burned. That night, the dreams intensified. I was no longer drowning in them. I was standing on the lake bed, breathing easily while the world above shimmered. Light fractured through the surface in wavering bands, and something large circled just beyond my peripheral vision, stirring silt in slow spirals. I would wake with my sheets damp, not from sweat alone, but from something that smelled faintly brackish. I started checking the mattress for leaks. There were none. One evening, about 6 weeks after Tom vanished, there was a knock at my door. Soft, measured. Not the impatient rapping of a neighbor, just 3 deliberate taps. I froze in the middle of the living room. The clock read 3:17 a.m. My throat constricted. I waited for a voice to follow. None came. Another 3 taps, identical in spacing. My legs moved before I could argue with them. I approached the door slowly, every step a negotiation. The air carried that copper-wet scent again, stronger than it had ever been indoors. I pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway light flickered. Empty. No movement. No figure. But the carpet directly in front of my door was darkened. Damp. A small, irregular patch, as if something had stood there, dripping. I did not open it. I stood with my hand hovering inches from the knob, listening. After a minute, maybe 2, I heard it. Not in the hallway. Closer. On the other side of the door at floor level. A faint inhalation. Slow. Patient. As if the space beneath the threshold were enough to taste the air inside. I staggered back, choking on my own breath. The damp patch remained when I looked again. By morning it had dried completely. I considered calling the police, but what would they find? A memory, a smell, my own unraveling. Instead, I did something worse. I went to the lake that same afternoon. I told myself if it was coming to my door, then the boundary had already been crossed. Hiding would only make me prey. I needed to confront it on my terms. That's what I said. The sky hung low and gray, threatening rain. The air felt heavy, pressing against my lungs. I walked straight to the southern bend without stopping. No children today. No picnickers. The entire shoreline lay deserted, as if the world had quietly agreed to give us privacy. I stood at the edge and spoke before I could lose my nerve. "You don't have to follow me," I said. My voice trembled but did not break. "I won't tell anyone." The absurdity of negotiating with something that had killed a man did not escape me. The water remained still. For a moment I felt foolish, exposed, like someone shouting into a void. Then a ripple spread outward from the center of the lake, not wind-driven, not random, a deliberate disturbance. It moved toward me in a widening V. I held my ground. The surface bulged near the shore, and slowly, so slowly it felt ceremonial, the Dogman rose. Not with the violence of before, with control. Water cascaded off its shoulders in silver sheets. Its fur clung darker than the lake itself. It stood waist-deep at first, then stepped forward until its feet found mud. The smell hit me full force. My eyes watered. Up close I could see details I had missed, faint scarring around its wrists, as if something had once bound it. A jagged tear along one ear. Its chest rose and fell steadily now, no longer exhausted. Strength radiated from it in quiet waves. We faced each other at less than 15 feet. I could see my own distorted reflection in its eyes. Not animal eyes, not entirely. There was depth there, recognition again. It tilted its head the same way it had in the trees. A question. I swallowed. Why me? The words slipped out before I could stop them. It blinked once. Then impossibly, it took another step closer, but did not lower to all fours. It remained upright, mimicking my posture. Its mouth parted slightly. I braced for teeth. Instead, a sound emerged. Not a growl, not a howl, a rough approximation of a syllable. It scraped through its throat awkwardly, as if unused to forming shapes. I felt the world narrow to that sound. It tried again. The second attempt carried more structure. A broken echo. My name. Not perfect, not clean, but close enough that denial became impossible. Ice flooded my veins. I had never spoken my name at the lake. Not aloud. It had heard it somewhere else. My apartment. The hallway. Maybe closer than that. I staggered back a step. It did not advance further. It watched me with something that looked disturbingly like patience, as if waiting for me to understand a rule I had not yet been told. My mind raced through every possible explanation, mimicry, coincidence, madness, but none of them held. It spoke again, softer. The sound fractured midway, dissolving into a low rumble. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sentiment, but from sheer overload. This was no mindless predator. It was learning. From me. The realization hollowed me out. Tom had not been random. He had been a variable, an interference. The Dogman's gaze flicked briefly toward the water, then back to me. A subtle gesture, an invitation, or a command. I shook my head instinctively. No. The word felt fragile. It took one final step forward, close enough that I could see droplets clinging to individual strands of fur. Its hand, because that is what it was, a hand, lifted slightly, palm angled toward me. Not reaching to strike, reaching to offer. The lake behind it rippled outward in slow, widening rings. I understood then, in a way that made my knees weaken, that this was not about hunger. Not anymore. It had come out of the water once exhausted, then stronger, now deliberate. Something was changing, and I was part of that change. My name rasped from its throat again, clearer this time. The sound wrapped around me like cold wire. I took another step back, heels sinking into mud. "I'm not going with you," I whispered, though I had no idea what going meant. The creature's expression did not shift into anger. It shifted into something worse: disappointment. The water behind it surged suddenly, as if stirred by something vast moving beneath. The surface split farther out, another swell rising in answer. My breath caught. There were two disturbances now, two shapes pressing upward from the depths, and for the first time the dogman's gaze left me and turned toward the lake with something like anticipation. The second swell did not break the surface right away. It hovered there, a distortion beneath the skin of the lake, too large to dismiss as a fish and too deliberate to be wind. The dogman's posture changed in a way that made my stomach drop. Not fear, not aggression, expectation. Its ears angled forward, its body leaned subtly toward the water, as if listening to something I could not hear. The ripple widened, deepened, and for a moment I caught a glimpse of movement below, pale and elongated, sliding just under the surface like a shadow with weight. My mind scrambled for logic. Another one. The thought landed heavy and absolute. I had not been chosen because I was special. I had been chosen because I was convenient, a witness, a variable, or something worse. The dogman took a half-step sideways, clearing my line of sight to the lake. It did not look at me. It did not need to. I was no longer the center of its attention. The water split with a violent heave. Spray shot upward, catching the gray light in fractured arcs. What emerged was not identical to the first. This one was broader through the shoulders, its fur lighter, almost silver beneath the water. It rose more easily, as if accustomed to the motion, and its eyes locked onto the first creature immediately. Not on me, on him. I do not know why I assign that word, but it felt correct. The air thickened with that metallic scent until breathing became work. The two stood facing each other in the shallows, water streaming from their frames in steady rivulets. There was tension there, but not hostility. Something more intricate. Recognition layered with something like agreement. My heart pounded so violently, I thought I might faint. The first dogman, the one who had learned my name, shifted slightly, positioning itself between me and the second. Not protectively, strategically. I understood then with a sick clarity that I was not prey in the immediate sense. I was leverage. The second creature let out a low sound that vibrated across the water, deeper and steadier than the broken syllables I had heard before. It was not a word. It was a signal. The first responded in kind, a shorter rumble, almost deferential. The exchange lasted only seconds, but it carried weight. Decision-making. Hierarchy. My skin prickled as the second creature's gaze finally slid toward me. It was colder than the first's, less curious. Its nostrils flared slightly as if sampling my scent from a distance. I felt exposed in a way that went beyond physical vulnerability. Assessed, measured for function. I took another step back, mud sucking at my heel. I didn't ask for this, I heard myself say, though my voice sounded small against the lake's vast quiet. Neither creature reacted to the words, but the first tilted its head just slightly, the familiar gesture that had once seemed almost gentle. It took a slow step toward me again, raising that hand halfway between us. Not touching, not yet. The second shifted its weight, claws digging into mud, and for a split second I feared it would lunge. Instead it remained still, watchful. The first's mouth parted, and again that rough shaping of sound scraped through its throat. My name, clearer than before, followed by something else, a harsher syllable, unrecognizable, but repeated twice. I felt the edges of the world blur. It was not just mimicking anymore. It was building language. I shook my head violently. No, I whispered. I'm not. The rest of the sentence died in my mouth as the lake behind them erupted once more. Smaller disturbances this time. Not full breaches, but multiple ripples converging toward the shore. I counted 3. Then 4. Shapes moving beneath the surface in coordinated arcs. My vision tunneled. This was not a solitary anomaly. It was a pattern, a population. The first Dogman stepped closer until the heat radiating from its body reached me, despite the cold air. Its hand extended fully now, palm upward, an invitation impossible to misinterpret. The second creature shifted again, its gaze flicking between us with a sharpness that suggested impatience. I felt like a hinge between two forces I did not understand. The ground beneath my feet trembled subtly as more movement stirred below the lake. My thoughts fractured into desperate fragments. If I ran, they would catch me. If I stayed, something irreversible would occur. If I screamed, no one was close enough to hear. The first creature's eyes softened. There is no other word for it. And in that softness I saw the echo of the first night. Exhaustion. Emergence. It had not come out of the water fully formed in purpose. It had changed since then. Because of me? Because of proximity? The idea clawed at my chest. Tom's face flashed in my mind, the way his smile had died mid-expression. If I stepped forward now, would that protect others? Or doom them faster? The second creature released another low vibration, shorter this time. A warning. The first did not break eye contact with me. It made the broken syllable again, then tapped its own chest lightly with curled fingers. A gesture. Identity. Then it pointed, slow, deliberate, at me. I staggered back another step, nearly losing balance. I don't understand, I said. But even as I spoke, a terrible comprehension began to form. It was not asking me to follow as prey. It was asking me to mirror, to become something adjacent. No, I said again, louder now, anger. No, I said again, louder now, anger cracking through the fear. You don't get to decide that. The second creature's ears flattened at the sharpness of my tone. The ripples behind them intensified, water slapping harder against the shore. Time thinned again, stretched fragile and bright. The first Dogman's expression shifted, the softness receding into something resolute. It lowered its hand slowly, the invitation withdrawn. For a heartbeat, I felt relief. Then it stepped aside. The second surged forward without warning, not at me, past me. Its shoulder clipped my side with enough force to spin me to the ground. Mud filled my mouth. I scrambled up in blind panic, just as the second creature reached the brush at the edge of the clearing. There, half hidden in shadow, stood a figure I had not seen before. A man, older, camera hanging from his neck. He must have been hiking the perimeter, drawn by the disturbances. He stood frozen, eyes wide, as the silver-furred creature loomed over him. "Run," I screamed, but the word dissolved in the air. The second Dogman moved with horrifying efficiency. One swipe of its arm sent the camera flying. The man stumbled backward, tripping over exposed roots. The first creature remained where it was, watching me instead of the attack, watching my reaction. The second's jaws closed around the man's shoulder, not tearing immediately, but anchoring. The man's scream ripped through the clearing, raw and human, and devastating. I lunged forward without thinking, not out of bravery, out of reflex. "Stop!" I shouted, as if that word carried authority here. The first Dogman intercepted me with shocking speed, blocking my path. Its hand pressed against my chest, not clawing, not piercing, just holding me in place with immense strength. I beat against it uselessly, mud slicking my palms. Let me go! I screamed. For a fraction of a second. I will never for a fraction of a second. I will never forget that look. Not accusation, not even fear. Confusion. As if he could not reconcile the ordinary day he had been having with the reality unfolding. The first Dogman tightened its grip slightly, enough to bruise but not break. Its eyes bored into mine, and in them I saw the same expectation as before. Choose. The man's heels hit the waterline. He screamed again, voice cracking into something animal. I thrashed harder, nails digging into fur. I'll do it. The words tore out of me without conscious thought. The first creature stilled. The pressure against my chest eased a fraction. I'll do it, I repeated, voice shaking violently. Just stop. The second creature paused mid-drag, head turning toward us. The man sobbed in ragged gasps, half submerged now. The lake around him churned with those other shapes, circling closer. The first Dogman's gaze searched my face, measuring sincerity. I felt something inside me fracture cleanly. I'll go, I whispered. The words tasted like rust. For a suspended second, nothing moved. Then the first creature lowered its hand completely. It stepped aside. The second held position, jaws still clamped on the man's shoulder, but no longer pulling. The water calmed marginally, ripples widening outward instead of inward. My legs felt detached from my body as I took one step toward the shore. Then another. The mud sucked greedily at my boots. The first Dogman moved beside me, not touching, but close enough that I could feel its heat. The second watched with cold appraisal. When I reached the waterline, icy shock bit through my soles. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed to run, to retract the promise I had made in panic. The man's eyes locked onto mine again. This time there was understanding there, and horror. Please, he rasped, though I don't know if he meant for himself or for me. The first Dogman made a low sound, almost soothing. It stepped into the lake first, water climbing its legs without resistance. It extended its hand again. I looked at it for a long, suspended moment. The scars around its wrists seemed more pronounced in the gray light, a history written in pale lines. My chest felt hollow, scraped clean of anything but dread. I placed my hand in its palm. The contact was shockingly warm, solid. The grip tightened, not painfully but firmly, and it guided me forward. The cold swallowed my boots, my ankles, my knees. My breath came in sharp bursts. The second creature released the man abruptly, shoving him backward onto the mud. He scrambled away on hands and knees, sobbing, not looking back. I did not blame him. The water reached my waist. My muscles spasmed from the temperature. The first Dogman's eyes never left mine. There was no triumph there, only inevitability. Behind us, the shapes beneath the surface drew nearer, shadows converging in slow arcs. When the water reached my chest, panic finally detonated fully in my brain. "Wait!" I gasped. "What happens?" The creature tilted its head one final time. Then it pulled. Not downward violently, not like drowning, more like invitation becoming action. The lake closed over my shoulders, my throat, my mouth. Ice flooded my lungs. I tried to thrash, but its grip anchored me. The world above fractured into wavering light. Sound dulled instantly, replaced by a heavy, immersive silence, broken only by distant vibrations. My vision adjusted in slow horror. The shapes beneath the surface were clearer now. Not fish, not debris. Bodies. Dozens. Moving with fluid precision in the depths. My lungs screamed for air, but a strange pressure built inside my chest, expanding instead of collapsing. I expected darkness. Instead, something opened. A searing pain lanced along my wrists, as if invisible bindings tightened. I looked down through murky water and saw pale lines forming against my skin, scars being written in real time. My mouth opened in a silent scream, but no water rushed in. The first Dogman hovered before me, eyes steady, as if overseeing a procedure. The other shapes circled at a respectful distance. My heartbeat thundered once, twice, then slowed unnaturally. The burning in my lungs shifted into something else. Not air, not water. Something between. Understanding hit me with crushing clarity. This was not death. It was alteration. The surface above shimmered faintly, already feeling impossibly far away. My fingers spasmed, lengthening in perception, if not yet in form. The scars along my wrists deepened, sealing into permanence. The first Dogman released my hand, only when I no longer fought. Only when the panic dissolved into a numb, expanding quiet. It leaned closer, its muzzle inches from my face, and in the distorted acoustics of the lake, I heard it shape my name one last time. Not broken now, complete. Then the second creature's silhouette joined us in the depths, circling slowly, assessing the change. My thoughts grew heavy, but not extinguished. I realized with a detached horror that I was still conscious, still myself, just no longer entirely human. Above us, the surface smoothed back into calm, erasing disturbance. On the distant shore, the rescued man staggered into the trees, carrying a story no one would believe. And below, in the cold cradle of the lake, surrounded by patient shadows, I felt something inside me shift its allegiance from air to water, from fear to inevitability, as the transformation tightened its grip and refused to let go. The first sensation that convinced me I was not dead was the absence of pain. Not because it had ended, but because it had been replaced. The burning in my lungs, the slicing cold along my skin, the raw tearing along my wrists, all of it dulled into something expansive and strangely coherent. I was still aware of my body, but it no longer felt limited to the shape I remembered. The water pressed against me, not as an enemy, but as a medium, a boundary I could move through instead of drown in. My eyes adjusted fully to the dim, greenish light filtering from above. The lake floor sloped downward into a darker basin, where silt hovered in suspended clouds. Shapes moved through that haze with controlled grace. Not dozens, as I had first feared. 6, 7. Enough. The first Dogman remained directly in front of me, its gaze steady and intent. It watched not with pride or hunger, but with evaluation. The second circled at a measured distance, silver fur rippling in the current like pale smoke. The others kept farther back, silhouettes marked by variations in size and scarring. A community. The word formed in my mind, unbidden. Not a pack in the simple animal sense. Something structured. I tried to inhale out of habit and felt liquid slide into my mouth. Panic flared for half a second, but it did not choke me. My chest expanded in a different rhythm now. Not drawing oxygen in the way I understood, but exchanging something subtler. Pressure equalized instead of suffocating. The first Dogman reached forward and placed its palm against my sternum. The contact resonated, not physically, but internally, like a vibration passing through bone and into marrow. A pulse answered from somewhere deeper in the lake. I felt it more than heard it. A low-frequency hum that synchronized with my altered heartbeat. The scars around my wrists tightened, then cooled. When I looked down, the skin there had changed texture slightly, faint ridges raised like healed burns. I flexed my fingers. They responded, though the joints felt heavier, capable of extension beyond their former limits. Fear returned in a softer, more persistent wave. I was aware enough to understand what was being taken from me, even as I sensed what was being given. The surface shimmered above like a ceiling of broken glass. I wondered how much time had passed. Seconds? Minutes? The first Dogman tilted its head again, that now familiar gesture, and withdrew its hand from my chest. It made a low, complex sound, not directed at me alone, but outward. The others shifted position in response. Formation. Communication without words I could translate, but somehow grasped in intention. The silver-furred one approached closer, its gaze still clinical. It extended its own hand and pressed lightly against my forearm. Heat radiated from its touch, despite the surrounding cold. It traced one of the forming scars with a claw tip, not breaking skin, but testing resilience. I felt no pain, only a tremor of awareness. Approval, perhaps. The silver one released me and drifted backward. The first moved to my side instead of in front of me. A subtle repositioning. No longer evaluator and subject, now guide and initiate. The realization tightened something in my chest that might once have been grief. Images of the man on the shore flickered through my mind. Had he escaped fully? Would he speak? Would anyone listen? The thought felt distant, muted by the pressure of the present. The first Dogman gestured downward with a slow sweep of its arm. The basin below darkened into near black. I hesitated only a fraction before following. The water grew colder as we descended, though the sensation barely registered now. My body compensated automatically. The others fell into motion around us, forming a loose circle as we sank. The lake floor at that depth was not soft mud, but layered stone, fissured and irregular. And at the center of that depression lay something that did not belong to geology. A structure, not built in the human architectural sense, but arranged. Massive stones stacked in a rough spiral, descending into a central cavity that pulsed faintly with bioluminescent algae. The glow painted the creature's fur in ghostly greens and blues. My mind strained to reconcile the sight. This had existed beneath the lake all along, hidden, intentional. The first Dogman guided me toward the spiral's edge. As we approached, the hum intensified, vibrating through my ribs. I sensed the other's attention sharpen. Ceremony. The word pressed forward again, insistent. I tried to speak, to ask something coherent, but only a distorted ripple of sound escaped my throat. The first turned its head slightly toward me, listening to the garbled attempt without mockery. It placed its hand over my mouth gently, not silencing, but steadying. Then it lowered its own face closer to mine and released a series of sounds, structured, layered, complex. My mind did not translate them into English. Instead, impressions formed. Memory, exile, return. The scars on its wrists were not random. They marked a previous boundary crossed. It had once been something else. Human? The idea shuddered through me. The spiral structure loomed closer. At its center, the cavity widened into a shaft that descended beyond visible light. The algae glow intensified around its rim, illuminating carvings etched into stone. Lines intersecting, circles within circles, patterns that resembled ripples frozen in permanence. I reached out without thinking and touched one. The stone thrummed beneath my fingertips. A surge of imagery flooded me, water rising over a shoreline centuries ago, figures standing at its edge not unlike I had, offering themselves or being offered. A lineage, not ancient in mythic abstraction, but concrete and recurring. The lake was not origin, it was conduit. The first Dogman withdrew my hand from the carving, before the vision overwhelmed me. It placed both of its hands on my shoulders and guided me toward the shaft's opening. I resisted reflexively, not violently, just enough to signal uncertainty. I looked once more toward the surface, 100 feet below the surface. I looked once more toward the surface, faint and unreachable. The first Dogman's gaze followed mine briefly, then returned to my face. It made a softer sound, almost intimate. Assurance, not safety exactly. Continuity. I understood then that the descent was not optional in the sense I had once known choice. It was completion. I allowed myself to be guided forward. The edge of the shaft swallowed light rapidly as we crossed its threshold. Darkness folded around us, but not absolute. Faint luminescence traced along the walls in branching veins. The descent was slower than I expected, controlled, deliberate. The pressure increased, but did not crush. My ears adjusted without pain. The hum deepened into a resonance that aligned with my altered heartbeat. At a certain depth, the shaft widened into a cavern. The ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow. The floor was smooth stone, worn by time and current. At the cavern's center stood another formation, taller, more refined. A column of rock pierced through with channels where water flowed in precise streams. The streams converged at its base into a shallow pool, glowing brighter than anything above. The first Dogman released my shoulders and moved ahead, stepping into the shallow pool. The water there shimmered differently, almost viscous with light. It turned back and extended its hand once more. I hesitated only a breath before stepping in beside it. The liquid warmth wrapped around my legs. It felt alive. The silver-furred one joined on my other side, flanking me. The others positioned themselves evenly around the pool's perimeter. The hum reached a crescendo, then stabilized. The first Dogman placed its palm against my chest again. The silver mirrored the gesture on my back. Energy, there is no more precise word, moved through me in a controlled surge. Not chaotic pain like before. Directed alteration. My spine arched involuntarily as sensation rippled outward along nerves. My jaw ached, then shifted subtly. My fingers elongated another fraction, nails thickening. My senses expanded in disorienting layers. I could perceive the faint electrical fields of the others' bodies, the minute currents flowing through stone, the distant movement of fish far above. My humanity did not vanish in a clean cut. It thinned, stretched, incorporated. Memories flickered. Mara's laugh, Tom's grin, the hallway at 3:17 a.m. But they felt archived rather than immediate. The first Dogman's eyes never left mine during the process. It held me steady as the transformation aligned. When the surge subsided, I remained upright without their support. The scars on my wrists glowed faintly, then dimmed to a permanent pale. The silver-furred one withdrew its hand first, stepping back in apparent satisfaction. The others relaxed their stances marginally. The first Dogman lowered its palm from my chest and regarded me with something unmistakably like recognition, not as subject, not as prey, as equal within boundary. It spoke again, a fluid sequence of sounds far clearer than before. This time fragments aligned in my altered perception, not words, but meaning. You remain. The phrase echoed internally. I touched my own chest cautiously. I was still there, altered, expanded, but not erased. The relief that accompanied that realization was complex and edged with sorrow. The ceremony, because that is what it was, concluded not with triumph, but with integration. The others approached one by one, touching my forearm or shoulder briefly, establishing connection. Not dominance, acknowledgement. The cavern's hum softened into a steady background presence. The first Dogman stepped out of the luminous pool and gestured toward a side passage carved into the stone. The silver took the opposite direction with two others, dispersing into the network beyond. I remained for a moment, staring at the glowing water. The surface of it reflected a distorted image back at me. My face was still mine in structure, but subtler changes marked it. Eyes slightly more reflective, pupils adjusting faster, cheekbones sharper beneath skin that seemed less fragile. I inhaled experimentally and felt the cavern respond. The first waited patiently near the passage entrance. When I joined it, it began to move through the tunnel with measured strides. I followed, my movements adapting instinctively to the terrain. The passage wound upward gradually, connecting back toward the lake's main basin through hidden channels. Along the walls, more carvings appeared, records perhaps, marks corresponding to individuals. I recognized the pattern that matched my own scars, newly etched into stone. A place among them. The enormity of that implication settled heavily. I was not anomaly. I was continuation. As we emerged into a higher, broader chamber nearer the lake floor, faint daylight filtered through cracks above. The others were dispersed now, some ascending toward the surface, others settling into niches along stone ledges. Routine. The first Dogman stopped and faced me directly. For the first time since the descent, it seemed almost uncertain. It lifted its hand and pressed two fingers lightly against my temple. A cascade of impressions flowed. How to move through water without turbulence, how to surface unseen, how to listen for disturbances miles away through current alone. Knowledge transferred not verbally but viscerally. When it withdrew, the lake felt mapped within me. The first then pointed upward toward the surface, then to me, then toward the distant shoreline beyond visible range, an invitation of a different kind. Not descent, ascent. My altered heart tightened. I understood. Return. Not to resume a human life fully, but to move between, to observe, to choose. The cycle required interface. I looked toward the faint light above, thinking of streets and doors and the smell of coffee in the morning. I thought of the man who had escaped, carrying his impossible story. I thought of Tom and the cost that had brought me here. Guilt flared, then softened into something more complex. I could not undo what had happened, but I could influence what happened next. The first Dogman watched me process this with patient stillness. I nodded once, a gesture more human than necessary. It mirrored the nod imperfectly, a small echo of my own habit. Then it moved aside, granting space. I propelled myself upward through the water with newfound efficiency. The lake embraced the motion, parting cleanly around me. As I neared the surface, light fractured brighter. I paused just beneath it, listening. Distant boat engine far off. Wind across reeds. No immediate human presence at the southern bend. I broke the surface silently. Air felt thin, but not hostile. I drew it in experimentally. It filled my lungs differently now, but sustained. I waded toward shore, emerging with controlled balance. The world looked sharper, edges defined, scents layered. I stood at the waterline where everything had changed weeks before. My reflection in the shallow edge was altered, but passable, human enough at a glance. The scars on my wrists remained visible, but subtle. I flexed my fingers, testing boundaries. They responded fluidly. From the depths, I felt the first Dogman's awareness still connected faintly to mine. Not surveillance, kinship. The shoreline lay quiet. The reeds swayed as they always had. But I was no longer the man who had once stood here fishing alone. I stepped onto dry ground, water dripping from my clothes without chill. In the distance, along the tree line, I sensed movement. An animal, mundane, unaware of the hidden structure beneath its habitat. I began walking toward the path that led back to the road. Each step felt deliberate, each breath layered with dual belonging. Somewhere in town, life continued with its plausible explanations. Somewhere, a man told a story no one believed. And beneath the lake, a community waited not for conquest, but for continuity. As I reached the gravel path, I paused and looked back once. The surface was smooth, reflecting clouds in pale fragments. No sign of what lay below. That was the design. I turned toward town with the knowledge settling into me like a second spine. I had been chosen, yes, but I had also chosen in return. And the next time someone stood alone at that water's edge, it would be my decision, mine, to determine whether the cycle repeated or whether I would finally break it, drying against my clothes, in a way that left no stain, no mud. My reflection in storefront glass moved in sync with me, human in outline, unremarkable in posture. But the world had shifted in its layering. I could feel the storm drain beneath the sidewalk, the thin trickle of water moving through it like a whispered conversation. I could sense the river miles off, feeding the lake in steady pulses. It was not sound. It was not sight. It was a constant undercurrent of awareness threading through my bones. I reached my apartment building and paused at the entrance. The memory of that damp patch outside my door flickered through me. The smell had been invitation, not threat, a call I had not yet understood. I climbed the stairs slowly, aware of each pipe within the walls. They hummed faintly, a network of narrow arteries carrying echoes of something far older than plumbing. When I unlocked my door, the air inside greeted me as familiar and foreign at once. The faint copper scent lingered, but softer now, almost affectionate. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it, breathing in both worlds at once. My heart beat slower than it once had, but stronger. I walked to the bathroom without turning on the light. The drain at the bottom of the tub reflected a faint shimmer, like distant starlight in miniature. I crouched and removed the towel I had stuffed there weeks ago. The pipe below vibrated gently in response. I did not feel fear. I felt connection. I placed my hand over the opening and exhaled softly. The vibration answered. A subtle acknowledgement from far below the city, where runoff eventually found the river, and the river found the lake. There were paths everywhere. I stood and caught sight of myself in the mirror. The differences were subtle but undeniable. My eyes held light differently, pupils adjusting with predatory precision. The planes of my face seemed sharper, as if shadow favored them. When I raised my wrists, the pale scars were visible but not grotesque. Anyone might assume an old injury. They throbbed faintly, not in pain but in resonance, as if responding to a rhythm I could not yet fully decipher. I slept that night without dreams, not because I was free of them, but because I no longer needed them. The lake's awareness hummed at the edge of consciousness, steady and grounding. When I woke at 3:17 a.m., it was not from fear. It was because something brushed the perimeter of the lake miles away. A disturbance. I sat upright instantly, senses sharpening. Through pipes and groundwater and buried channels, I felt it clearly. A boat. Small. Motor idling low. Someone fishing alone near the northern shore. The old version of me would have dismissed the thought as paranoia. I stood and dressed slowly. Movements. I stood and dressed slowly. Movements fluid. The decision before me felt heavy but not forced. The cycle did not require constant taking. It required balance. I left the apartment and drove without headlights for the last mile, trusting my adjusted vision. The lake greeted me in darkness, its surface black and glassy. The boat's silhouette floated near the reeds on the opposite side. A man sat hunched with a rod in hand, unaware of the currents mapping him in slow spirals. I waded into the water silently, submerging without splash. The cold did not bite. It embraced. Beneath the surface, others shifted in the distance, but did not converge. They waited. The first Dogman hovered deeper, watching me with that same patient attention it had once turned on me. I approached the underside of the boat carefully, circling once. The man above hummed to himself, the vibration faint but clear through the hull. I rose just enough that my head broke the surface behind the stern. He did not see me at first. I studied him in the dim starlight. Younger than Tom had been, nervous energy in his posture. A man running from something, perhaps. I felt the old pattern tug at me, the ease of repeating what had been done to me, the promise of continuity. The lake pulsed softly, not demanding, simply present. I reached up and tapped the boat's side lightly. The sound echoed hollow across the water. The man froze. "Hello?" he called, voice thin. I let the silence stretch. Then I moved around the boat's perimeter slowly, just beneath the surface, creating a wake that rocked it gently. Panic began to seep into his movements. He stood abruptly, shining a flashlight into the water. The beam cut through darkness, grazing my shoulder for a split second. I saw recognition dawn, not of me specifically, but of wrongness. I could have surged upward then, could have dragged him cleanly into the lake before he found balance. Instead, I held position. The scars on my wrists tingled. The first Dogman's awareness pressed closer, evaluating my choice. The man fumbled with the motor cord. It sputtered weakly. I surfaced fully at the bow, allowing him to see my face clearly. His scream tore across the lake. "What the hell?" he choked. I tilted my head slightly, mirroring the gesture that had once undone me. "Go home," I said. The words came out rougher than before, but unmistakably human. He stared, trembling, flashlight beam shaking violently. "You, what are you?" I did not answer. I let my eyes reflect the faint starlight, let him see enough to believe the impossible. "Go home," I repeated, firmer now. Beneath the water, the others shifted uneasily, sensing divergence from pattern. The first Dogman did not intervene. The man yanked the motor cord again. This time it caught. The engine roared to life, loud and frantic. He steered away clumsily, nearly colliding with reeds in his haste. I remained still as the boat shrank into darkness. The lake's hum deepened, not in anger but in recalibration. I descended slowly, rejoining the others below. The silver-furred one approached first, its gaze sharp with inquiry. It circled me once, then flicked its eyes upward toward the receding engine noise. Question. I responded not with sound, but with the internal resonance I had been shown, an impression of restraint. The silver's posture stiffened, uncertain. The first Dogman moved between us, placing a steadying hand on my shoulder. It regarded me for a long moment, then gave a subtle nod. Acceptance, if not agreement. The others dispersed gradually. The pattern had shifted, but not shattered. When I returned to shore and drove back to town, a quiet clarity settled into me. I was not merely bridge or bait. I was variable. The cycle did not dictate without room for alteration. Days passed without incident. I moved through my human routines carefully, observing more than participating. I noticed how often people stood near water without understanding its depth. Children leaning too far over docks, couples arguing beside the river's edge. The temptation to intervene or withdraw hovered constantly. The lake remained steady in the background, its awareness a second heartbeat. Then, one afternoon, I felt something new. Not from the lake outward, from inland, inward. A sharp disturbance along the river upstream. Multiple vibrations, mechanical, intrusive. I closed my eyes in my office chair and traced the sensation. Trucks parked near the old logging access road, metal clanking, voices. The intention carried in their movements was unmistakable. Equipment, dredging gear. The rumor had circulated quietly for months about expanding the reservoir, about deepening sections to increase capacity. I had dismissed it as bureaucratic noise. Now I felt the threat clearly. The spiral, the cavern, the conduit beneath. Exposure would not be mere inconvenience. It would be catastrophic. I stood abruptly and left work without explanation. By the time I reached the access road, 3 trucks were already parked near the riverbank. 2 men in reflective vests unloaded equipment, while a third surveyed the area with a clipboard. I approached slowly, suppressing the instinct to bare teeth. "What's going on?" I asked evenly. The clipboard man glanced at me with mild irritation. "Preliminary assessment," he said. "City's considering sediment removal. Need to measure depth variations." Sediment removal. The phrase sounded sterile and harmless. It meant excavation, disturbance. He gestured vaguely toward the river. "Lake's next phase, if this goes through." My scars flared faintly under my sleeves. "When?" I asked. "Couple of weeks, maybe. Depends on permits." He returned to his notes dismissively. I walked closer to the river's edge, feeling the water's tension spike in response to the machinery. The first Dogman's awareness surged upward sharply. Alarm, not panic. Focus. I turned back to the men. "It's unstable down there," I said. "Sinkholes. You could collapse the shoreline." The clipboard man snorted softly. "Appreciate the concern. We've got geologists." I stepped closer, letting my eyes hold his longer than comfortable. "You don't know what's down there," I said quietly. Something in my tone unsettled him despite himself. He shifted weight. "We know enough," he replied, but less certain now. I realized then that persuasion would not be enough. Human bureaucracy did not respond to warnings from lone voices. It responded to liability, fear. I let my awareness dip briefly into the river beneath us, stirring a subtle current. The water along the bank swirled unexpectedly, undercutting soil near one of the trucks. A small section of ground slumped inward with a splash. The men jumped back instinctively. "Jesus," one muttered. I stepped away, feigning surprise. "Told you," I said softly. The clipboard man stared at the unstable bank, recalculating. "We'll reassess," he muttered finally. "No point risking equipment." They began loading tools back into the trucks with less confidence than before. I remained until they drove off, engines fading into distance. The river calmed gradually, tension easing. I exhaled slowly. The first Dogman's presence brushed against my awareness, with something close to approval. That night, beneath the lake's surface, the community gathered closer than usual. Not ceremony, council. The silver-furred one's agitation was palpable. Exposure threatened all of us, not just secrecy. I projected the memory of the collapsing bank, the retreat of the trucks. The ripple of understanding spread among them. Adaptation did not always require taking. Sometimes it required influence. The first Dogman held my gaze longer than before, as if reassessing my place within the structure. Then it turned toward the deeper cavern and gestured subtly. Not descent this time. Not transformation. Inclusion. I followed as the others arranged themselves along the cavern's perimeter. The hum of the spiral intensified slightly, not in ritual, but in alignment. I felt the weight of collective memory pressing gently against mine. Seasons, generations, near exposures averted, losses endured. The cycle had never been mindless predation. It had been survival through balance. Too much taking drew attention. Too little integration weakened continuity. My choice at the boat had not broken them. It had introduced variation. The silver-furred one's posture softened incrementally as it absorbed this recalibration. The first Dogman stepped forward and pressed its palm against the central column. The channels within it glowed faintly brighter. The others followed, one by one. When my turn came, I placed my hand against the stone and felt my own resonance join theirs. The scars on my wrists pulsed in harmony. Above us, the lake lay undisturbed. In town, people slept unaware of how close they had come to excavation. As the hum settled into a steady cadence, I understood with quiet certainty that I was no longer torn between worlds. I was part of the mechanism that allowed both to persist. The next time someone stood alone at the water's edge, the choice would not be reflex or replication. It would be weighed. And for the first time since that night on the dock, the weight did not feel like condemnation. It felt like responsibility. I need you to understand something before I go any further. I didn't go back to that lake because I was brave. I went back because I couldn't live with the not knowing. By then the town had already started whispering. They found my truck at the access road 3 days after the storm, half sunk in mud, driver's door hanging open like a broken jaw. They dragged the shallows with hooks and nets. They said the current could have taken me under. They said men disappear in water all the time. What they never said out loud, but I heard it in the way their voices thinned when they looked at the tree line, was that something else had been out there with me. I let them believe I drowned. It was easier than telling them what actually pulled itself out of that black water. I waited until the search thinned, until the deputies stopped idling by the dock at night. Then I went back alone. I told myself I just wanted my tackle box. That was a lie. I wanted proof. I wanted to see if the shoreline still remembered. The air was colder than it should have been for late summer, the kind of cold that sits low and damp against your ankles. The storm had stripped branches from the pines, and the smell of sap mixed with the sour scent of churned mud. My boots sank with each step, a slow sucking sound that felt too loud in the quiet. The lake looked smaller in daylight. That unsettled me more than if it had looked larger. It meant the night hadn't exaggerated it. It meant the darkness hadn't played tricks on my depth perception. The water lay flat and dull, a sheet of tarnished metal under a pale sky. I stood at the exact place where my chair had been, where the thermos had tipped over, where I'd first heard that low, wrong breathing from somewhere out beyond the reeds. I expected claw marks gouged into the bank. I expected a crater where something heavy had hauled itself up. Instead, I found only a long smear in the mud, almost graceful, as if a massive body had slid forward on its belly before rising. My stomach tightened. I crouched despite myself and pressed my hand into that dried track. The mud was hardened now, ridged and cracked, but the shape was there, too wide for a man, too deliberate for driftwood. I told myself it could have been a deer dragged by current. I told myself storms move strange things. But deer don't breathe like that. Deer don't stand upright. I didn't realize I was shaking until my teeth clicked together. The silence pressed in, thick as wool. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to curve around that stretch of shoreline and move on. I remember thinking that the world felt edited, like something had cut the sound from this one patch of earth. I walked the bank slowly, scanning for anything else out of place. That's when I saw the prints. They weren't clear at first, just depressions spaced too evenly to ignore. 5 toes, long, The claws had cut deeper than the pads. I measured one against my palm and felt a sick sort of clarity bloom in my chest. It was bigger than my hand, bigger than my boot. The stride between them was wrong, too, longer than any man could manage without breaking into a run. But there were no scuff marks, no signs of scrambling. Whatever had made them moved with balance, with purpose. I straightened and turned toward the water without meaning to. The surface gave nothing back. That was the worst part. If it had rippled, if something had broken through, I might have screamed or run or done something human. Instead, it just watched me in its own flat way. I whispered, "I know you're real," before I could stop myself. The words sounded ridiculous in the open air. They sounded small. The echo that came back from across the lake was thinner than it should have been. I stood there too long. I know that now. I should have left as soon as I saw the prints. But there's a kind of gravity to fear once you've named it. It pulls you closer to the edge instead of away. I wanted to see it again, in daylight. I wanted to prove to myself that my memory hadn't grown teeth in the dark. So I waited. Minutes stretched. The cold crept up through the soles of my boots. My fingers went numb, even though the sun hung overhead. I tried to focus on ordinary details, the smell of wet leaves, the faint hum of the highway miles away. But they kept slipping out of reach. The lake began to look deeper. I don't mean darker, I mean deeper, as if the waterline had sunk inch by inch without me noticing. My breath shortened. I told myself it was panic. I told myself the mind can bend perspective. Then a bubble rose near the center, slow and round. It popped without a sound. Another followed. Then another. They formed a crooked line moving toward shore. I took one step back. Just one. My heel caught on a root, and I windmilled my arms to stay upright. That was when the water broke. It didn't explode upward like in the movies. It parted, quietly. A shape pushed through with the patience of something that had no need to hurry. First the snout, long and slick, water streaming from coarse fur. Then the eyes. God, the eyes. Yellow in the gray light, not glowing, just reflecting, like a predator's caught in headlights. They fixed on me with a steadiness that felt almost clinical. It rose higher, shoulders emerging, broader than I remembered. The fur clung in dark ropes. The chest expanded with a breath that made the surface around it tremble. I smelled it before it fully stood. Wrought and iron, and something wild, like an animal den sealed too long. My legs locked. I wish I could tell you I ran. I didn't. I stared like prey that hasn't accepted its prey yet. It stepped forward, and the water slid off its body in sheets. When it planted one foot on the mud, I heard the suction tear as it pulled free. The claws sank deep. It rose onto its hind legs fully then, towering, spine straightening with a soft series of pops that carried across the still air. I felt those sounds in my own bones. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying me. There was intelligence there, not human, not gentle, but aware. A thin line of saliva hung from its jaw and snapped in the breeze. I managed one word. Why? I don't know why that was what came out. It didn't answer. Of course it didn't. But its ears twitched at the sound of my voice. It took another step. I stumbled back, heart slamming so hard my vision flickered. The world narrowed to the space between us. I thought of all the stories I'd half laughed at in bars. I thought of how easy it is to dismiss something until it stands in front of you dripping lake water. It lowered itself slightly, muscles bunching under wet fur. I knew then it could close the distance in less than a second. I braced for impact. Instead it inhaled sharply, nostrils flaring. It was scenting me. The realization burned worse than any wound. I was being catalogued, measured, weighing my worth as meat or threat or something else entirely. My hands went numb. I forced them open and let my empty palms show. A stupid instinct, like you'd use on a stray dog. Its gaze dropped to my hands, then back to my face. And for a flicker of a moment, just a flicker, I saw something shift there. Not mercy. Recognition. That's the only word I have for it. Recognition of what? I still don't know. My knees nearly gave out. I whispered, "I won't tell." I meant it. I would have swallowed the memory whole if it had let me. The creature's lips peeled back slightly, exposing teeth too long, too clean. It wasn't a snarl. It was something worse. An evaluation. Then, without warning, its head snapped toward the tree line behind me. The movement was so abrupt I flinched. I hadn't heard anything, but it had. A branch cracked in the distance. Human weight, not animal. My blood ran cold in a new way. Was my mistake. I turned my back for half. Was my mistake. I turned my back for half a second. In that half second, it moved. A blur of dark muscle and mud. It didn't charge me. It streaked past, so close the air punched from my lungs. The smell engulfed me, thick and suffocating. I hit the ground hard, cheek slamming into cold earth. By the time I rolled onto my back, it had already reached the trees. I heard a shout, high, startled, unmistakably human. Then it cut off, not with a scream, with a choking sound, like breath stolen mid-word. The forest swallowed the rest. I lay there paralyzed, listening to the aftermath. Leaves rustled, something heavy shifted, then silence again. That edited, unnatural silence. My chest heaved. I wanted to run in the opposite direction. I wanted to crawl into the lake and sink. Instead, I forced myself to sit up. My ears rang. I strained for any sign of movement, any second voice calling out. Nothing. Minutes passed, or seconds. Time lost shape. Finally, I staggered to my feet. The tree line loomed only 20 yards away. It might as well have been miles. I took one step toward it, then another. Each footfall felt like signing a contract I didn't understand. The forest smelled sharper, pine and damp earth overlaying that metallic tang. I parted the low branches with shaking hands. The ground inside was torn, not randomly. There was a path carved through underbrush, crushed ferns marking the direction it had taken. I followed. I don't know why. Maybe because I needed to see the cost. Maybe because I couldn't stand the thought of leaving someone else to vanish into rumor. The deeper I went, the darker it became despite the afternoon sun. The canopy swallowed light. My breath sounded too loud in my ears. I called out once, softly. No answer. 10 yards in, I saw blood. Not much. Just a spray across a fallen log, bright against bark. My stomach lurched, but I kept moving. Another few steps and I found a cap lying in the dirt. Camo. I recognized it. A kid from town wore one like that when he rode his bike past my place. I knelt and picked it up. It was still warm. I felt the warmth through my palm, and something inside me cracked. I should have warned people. I should have spoken after the first night. I told myself no one would have believed me. That excuse tastes rotten now. A low growl rolled through the trees ahead, not loud but close. I froze. It wasn't the sound of feeding, it was a warning. I had crossed some invisible boundary. I placed the cap back on the ground carefully, as if that gesture mattered. My throat tightened. "I'm leaving," I said to the dark. The growl deepened a fraction, then stopped. I backed away step by step, never turning around this time. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew better. Predators chase movement. When I finally broke past the tree line into the open air, my lungs collapsed in relief. The lake looked unchanged, peaceful, lying. I didn't look back at the forest again. I walked to my truck on legs that felt borrowed. I drove home without turning on the radio. That evening, the sirens started. They combed the woods with flashlights and dogs. The dogs wouldn't go near the water. I watched from my window as red and blue lights flickered against the low clouds. I said nothing. I said nothing when they found only scraps of torn fabric and a smear of blood too diluted for answers. I said nothing when the town held a vigil by that same shoreline. I stood at the edge of the crowd and stared at the water, and for one sickening second, I thought I saw a ripple moving toward the dock. It didn't break the surface. It didn't need to. I felt its attention like a hand between my shoulder blades. I knew then that it hadn't spared me out of kindness. It had chosen me, and I still don't understand why. I didn't sleep after that. Not the night of the sirens. Not the night after. Not really at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard that choking sound again, the one that cut off too quickly to be a scream. It's strange what the mind clings to. Not the sight of it rising from the lake, not the teeth, just that half-formed cry swallowed by the trees. I kept thinking if I could replay it enough times, I'd hear a word in it, a name, a warning, something I could use to justify what I'd done, or hadn't done. I told myself I was in shock, that silence was self-preservation. But silence starts to rot after a while. It seeps into everything. The town felt different within a week, not loud about it. No one used words like monster. They said missing. They said tragic accident. They said maybe he ran away. But the woods around the lake were suddenly avoided. Boats stayed docked. Windows locked earlier. Even the air seemed to hold its breath at dusk. I caught people looking at me sometimes, just a second too long. I had been the last known person out there before the storm. I had disappeared and come back with a story about getting lost hiking when my truck got stuck. I kept it simple. Mud, no signal, walked to the highway. It sounded plausible enough that no one pressed too hard. But plausibility has a smell, and I could tell some of them caught it on me, especially his mother. She stood outside the post office one afternoon, hands wrapped around a paper cup gone cold. Her eyes were hollowed out in a way I can't describe without sounding cruel. When she looked at me, I felt measured, weighed, the same way I'd been weighed at the shoreline. "You were out there," she said. Not accusing, not pleading, just stating a fact. I nodded. My throat closed. She held my gaze longer than anyone had since the thing in the water. "Did you hear anything?" she asked. That was my moment. If I'd been a braver man, I would have broken right there. I would have told her about the prints, the breath, the way the forest swallowed sound. Instead, I shook my head. Once. The smallest lie I've ever told. It felt enormous. She studied my face for a flicker of something. I don't know what she saw, but she nodded slowly, as if confirming something to herself, and walked away. I stood there long after she left, the cold creeping through my jacket, the weight of that single shake of my head settling into my bones. That night, the dreams changed. They weren't about the attack anymore. They were about the lake itself. In the dream, I stood at the edge while the water receded inch by inch, exposing mud, then rocks, then something vast and ribbed beneath, like the spine of a buried animal stretching across the entire basin. And in the hollow between those ridges, I saw yellow eyes opening one by one. I'd wake with the taste of iron in my mouth, and the sheets twisted tight around my legs. The worst part wasn't fear. It was the pull. I began to feel drawn back there, the way a sore tooth draws your tongue. Not because it's pleasant, Because it's there. Because you need to test if it still hurts. I lasted 11 days before I returned. This time I didn't park at the main access. I left my truck along an old logging road half a mile east and cut through brush to reach the far side of the lake. If it watched the usual shoreline, I didn't want it expecting me. The sky hung low and white, heavy with unspent rain. The woods were louder than before. Birds argued overhead. Insects whined. It was almost a relief. I told myself the silence that day had been coincidence. Weather. Pressure. My own panic amplifying absence. But when I broke through the last line of trees and saw the water again, the sound dimmed. Not vanished, just softened, like someone had closed a door on the world behind me. The surface was restless this time, small ripples chasing one another without wind to guide them. I stood there, hands shoved into my pockets to hide their trembling. "I know you're here," I said quietly. No answer. I didn't expect one. I stepped closer. The mud sucked at my boots. There were no fresh prints that I could see, no obvious sign of movement. I crouched and touched the water. It was warmer than the air. That detail unsettled me more than anything else. Lakes don't hold heat like that after a cold front. I let my fingers sink deeper. The warmth intensified, as if something below radiated it. A memory surfaced then, unwanted. The way its chest had expanded, the tremor in the surface around it. What if it wasn't just living in the lake? What if it was part of it? I pulled my hand back sharply. The ripples widened outward from where I'd touched, intersecting with the restless pattern already there. For a moment, they aligned into something almost geometric, too precise. Then they dissolved. I told myself I was projecting. Grief and guilt can turn patterns into meaning. I stayed until dusk, long enough for the temperature to drop and the woods to darken into silhouettes. I wanted it to show itself. I wanted confirmation that I hadn't imagined the second encounter. Instead, I felt only that pressure again, subtle but undeniable, like being watched from underwater. Just before full dark, a shape broke the surface near the center. Not rising, just cresting briefly, like the arch of a back rolling beneath. It was too long for a log, too smooth for debris. My pulse spiked. "Why me?" I whispered, the same question as before. This time the water answered, not with words, with motion. The ripples began converging toward my side of the lake, slow at first, then faster, as if something massive cut through below. I staggered back. My heel slipped, and I fell hard onto the bank. The mud soaked through my jeans instantly, cold and gritty. The movement stopped 10 feet from shore. The surface stilled. I scrambled upright and retreated another step. A single clawed hand broke through the water at the edge. Just the hand. Long fingers splayed against mud. The fur clung dark and wet. It pressed into the bank, testing the ground. I couldn't breathe. The rest of it didn't rise. It didn't need to. That hand alone told me it was there, waiting, choosing. I felt something twist in my chest then that wasn't just fear. It was understanding, and it sickened me. It hadn't spared me randomly. It had marked me. The way predators sometimes leave one alive to track the herd. I was bait, or witness, or both. The hand flexed once, claws digging deeper. I saw mud pack under them. I saw the strength in the tendons. And then, slowly, it withdrew. The water closed over it with barely a splash. I stood there shaking until full dark swallowed the shoreline. I don't remember the walk back to my truck. I only remember the certainty settling in like a second spine. It wasn't done, and neither was I. The next morning, another person went missing, not near the lake this time, on a trail 2 miles north. No body, just torn earth and a smear of blood that led nowhere. The town could no longer pretend it was an accident. They organized search parties with rifles. They called in wildlife officers. They spoke in hushed tones about bears, about rabid wolves, about anything with a name that fit into a pamphlet. I watched the preparations from my porch and felt the weight of knowledge press down on me. Guns wouldn't matter. They were hunting something that understood them, something that watched from water and moved through forest like it owned both. I thought about going to the sheriff. I even drove halfway there. I sat in the parking lot with my engine idling, rehearsing the words. Dogman, out of the lake, stands upright, intelligent. I pictured the look on his face, the careful nod, the gentle suggestion of rest. Maybe a doctor, maybe grief counseling. And while they evaluated my sanity, more blood would soak into pine needles. I turned the engine off. I didn't go inside. That was the moment I crossed a line. Not when I lied to the mother, not when I returned to the lake, but when I decided that if this thing was choosing me, then I would choose back. I went home and took down my father's old hunting rifle from above the mantel. It hadn't been fired in years. I cleaned it with shaking hands, the smell of oil sharp in my nose. I laid out ammunition on the kitchen table like small brass promises. I wasn't delusional. I didn't think I could overpower it. But I needed something in my grip that felt like action, that felt like defiance. As night fell, I loaded the truck again. This time I didn't hide. I drove straight to the main access road and left the headlights on, beams cutting across the water like accusation. If it wanted me, it wouldn't have to search. I stepped out with the rifle cradled against my shoulder. The air was colder than it had been all week. The lake lay still, too still. I walked to the edge and stopped at the exact place where the first smear in the mud had dried. "I'm here," I said, louder than before. My voice carried. No immediate answer. I waited, breath fogging faintly in front of me. Minutes ticked by. The silence deepened until it felt structural, like a ceiling about to collapse. Then the water began to bulge outward from the center, swelling as if something enormous pushed up from beneath. I tightened my grip on the rifle. This was the point of no return. The surface split. The head rose first, water cascading down fur and snout. The eyes found me instantly. No confusion, no hesitation. It knew. It rose higher, shoulders clearing the surface. The chest expanded. The breath rolled across the lake. I lifted the rifle and aimed between those yellow eyes. My hand steadied in a way that surprised me. "Not tonight," I whispered. It stepped forward. The water parted around its thighs. I felt the ground under my boots vibrate faintly with each movement. I kept the sights aligned. The distance closed. 20 yards. 15. 10. Its gaze never left mine. There was no rush in it, no frenzy, just inevitability. I realized then that pulling the trigger wouldn't be about killing it. It would be about proving I could still choose something. It reached the shallows. Mud accepted its weight. It stood to full height, towering, dripping, ancient. The smell hit me again, thick and metallic. My finger tightened on the trigger. And just before I fired, it did something it hadn't done before. It spoke. Not in words, in a sound shaped almost like one. A low, guttural vibration that resolved into something painfully close to my name. My finger froze. The rifle trembled. Because I knew in that instant that it hadn't chosen me at random. And if I pulled that trigger, I might finally learn why. When it shaped that sound into something that almost carried my name, the world didn't shatter. It narrowed. The lake, the trees, the beam of my truck's headlights cutting white across the water. Everything dimmed, until there was only that sound hanging between us like a wire pulled too tight. My name, or a mockery of it. My finger rested against the trigger, pressure building, but the certainty I'd clung to dissolved. Predators don't call you by name. Storms don't learn your shape. I felt the rifle's stock bite into my shoulder as my arms began to shake. "You don't get to do that," I said, and the words came out thin, almost pleading. The creature's head tilted slightly, the same way it had that first day in the gray light. Its chest rose and fell slowly, deliberately, as if demonstrating control. Steam curled from its fur where the cold air met the heat of its body. It stepped closer, claws sinking into the mud with a wet, heavy sound. 8 yards now. I could see the texture of its fur, coarse and matted near the shoulders, slick along the limbs. I could see scars under the wet strands, old pale lines crossing its hide. It had fought before. It had survived before. My pulse pounded in my ears so loudly I almost didn't hear the second sound. It came softer this time, stretched longer. Not quite my name. Something older, maybe. Something that lived in the same space inside my chest where guilt had been growing. I swallowed hard. "What do you want?" The question felt absurd the moment it left my mouth, but it hung there anyway. The creature didn't lunge, didn't bare its teeth. Instead, it lowered itself slightly, not submissive, not aggressive, measured. Its gaze flicked once to the rifle, then back to me. I realized with a cold clarity that it understood what that object meant. It had seen guns before, maybe had felt them. The scars told that story. I tightened my jaw. "You killed them," I said louder now, anger threading through the fear. "You killed a kid." The word kid cracked in my throat. For the first time, its expression changed. Not remorse, not rage. Something like irritation. It took one step sideways, slow, deliberate, never breaking eye contact. And then, God help me, it gestured. One long clawed hand lifted from the mud and angled slightly toward the forest behind me. Not pointing, not human, but directional. I didn't turn immediately. I didn't want to give it my back again. "There's nothing there," I said, though I hadn't checked. The creature's ears flattened for a fraction of a second. It made that low vibration again, deeper now, and took another small step sideways. It was herding me, not toward the water, toward the trees. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap. But beneath that panic, something else stirred. A memory. The first night. The choking sound. The abrupt end. The way it had snapped its head toward the forest before moving. What if? I hated myself for even thinking it. What if it hadn't been hunting at the lake? What if it had been interrupted? My grip on the rifle loosened just slightly. "If I turn," I said quietly, "you stay. You stay." The words felt foolish, like bargaining with a storm. But it didn't move. Not forward, not back, just watched. I took one slow step backward toward the tree line, keeping the barrel trained on its chest. Then another. The mud sucked at my boots. The cold air stung my lungs. When I reached the first line of brush, I stopped and listened. The woods were not silent. They were restless. Too restless. A faint rustling, uneven and irregular, carried from deeper inside. Not the light scatter of small animals. Something heavier, something shifting weight. I flicked my gaze back to the creature. It hadn't advanced. It stood at the shoreline, tall and still, eyes fixed not on me now, but over my shoulder, watching the same direction. "You want me to see," I murmured, more to myself than to it. The rifle felt heavier by the second. Slowly, carefully, I pivoted, keeping my peripheral vision on the lake as long as I could. The forest swallowed the truck's headlights after only a few yards. Shadows layered over shadows. The rustling grew clearer. A branch snapped. My heart slammed. "Who's there?" I called, hating how small my voice sounded. No answer, just that uneven movement. I took a cautious step forward into the trees, then another. The air was colder here, damp and thick. The smell hit me first, a sour tang, not the metallic rot of the creature, but something sharper. Human sweat, unwashed fabric, fear. I moved toward it slowly, rifle raised again. The rustling shifted left. I pivoted. A shape darted behind a trunk, too quick to identify. Not tall, not furred, smaller. "Show yourself," I shouted. Silence. Then a whisper of fabric against bark. I advanced another few yards and nearly tripped over something on the ground. I looked down. Rope. Coarse and frayed, half buried in leaves. Not old, recently cut. My stomach turned. Another step and I saw a depression in the earth, shallow but wide, as if something heavy had been dragged there and then moved. My mind began to rearrange the pieces, whether I wanted it to or not. Missing people, torn fabric, blood leading nowhere, the creature herding me here. A sudden crack of a twig behind me made me spin. The rifle swung up, and that's when I saw him. Not the creature, a man, mid-30s maybe, beard overgrown, eyes too bright. He stood half-concealed behind a tree, hands raised slowly when he saw the gun aimed at his chest. "Easy," he said, voice hoarse. "Easy." My brain struggled to catch up. A man, out here, at night. "Who are you?" I demanded. He swallowed. "I could ask you the same." His gaze flicked past me toward the lake. Fear flashed there. "It," he breathed. Not a question. "It," he breathed. Not a question, a statement. Cold realization slid through me. "Saw what?" I pressed, though I knew. He shook his head quickly. "I didn't mean for it to go like this." The words tumbled out too fast. "I was tracking it, for weeks. I thought I understood its patterns. I thought I could lure it." My stomach dropped. "Lure it with what?" His silence answered. Images flashed in my mind. The cap in the dirt, the shallow depression, the rope. "You used them," I said, horror rising. "You brought people out here." "I didn't kill them," he snapped, voice cracking. "It did." "Because you fed them to it." My shout echoed through the trees. The rustling intensified somewhere to our right. His eyes darted that direction. "You don't understand," he hissed. "It's territorial. It doesn't hunt randomly. It protects something. The lake is just—" He cut himself off as a low growl rolled through the forest. Not from the shoreline, from behind us, closer than before. The man's face drained of color. "It followed you," he whispered. "No," I said, breath shallow. "It brought me." The growl deepened, vibrating through the ground. Leaves trembled. The man backed up a step, hands still raised. "I was trying to prove it," he babbled. "To get footage, evidence. No one believes without proof." His words felt like a mirror held up to my own silence. "How many?" I asked, barely audible. He didn't answer. The growl cut off abruptly. That sudden absence of sound was worse than the noise. I felt it before I saw it, a shift in the darkness behind him. 2 yellow eyes opening at shoulder height. The man froze. He must have sensed it too, because his breath hitched mid-inhale. "Don't move," I whispered. though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. The creature stepped forward from the shadows, silent despite its size. It wasn't wet now. It had circled through the trees while I was distracted, herding, strategizing. Its gaze never touched me. It locked onto the man. The air between them felt charged. "You don't have to do this," the man stammered, backing up until his shoulders hit the trunk. He looked at me then, desperation flaring. "Shoot it!" I raised the rifle. The sight lined up on the creature's chest. My finger tightened. But the memory of that almost word, my name, stopped me. The creature's eyes flicked to me for half a second, not pleading, not commanding, simply aware. The man bolted. He lunged sideways, crashing through brush. The forest erupted with motion. The creature moved in a blur, faster than my eyes could track. A heavy impact, a scream this time, full and raw. I fired. The recoil slammed into my shoulder. The shot split the night. I don't know if I hit it. The scream cut off abruptly. Leaves settled slowly back into place. Smoke curled from the rifle barrel. My ears rang. I stood there trembling, staring into the darkness where they had vanished. Then, from deeper in the trees, came that low vibration again. Not angry, not triumphant, measured. It rolled through the forest and settled into my chest like a second heartbeat. I realized then that the missing people had not been random victims of a mindless predator. They had been bait in someone else's obsession, and I had just fired a shot that might have changed the balance between hunter and hunted. The growl faded. The woods held their breath. And somewhere beyond my sight, something decided whether I was still chosen or next. There are only a few pieces left to tell, and they don't unfold the way you might expect. After I fired into the dark and the forest swallowed both the man and the creature, the night did not explode into chaos. It thinned. The echo of the gunshot rolled across the lake and died against the opposite shore. And for a few seconds I believed I had changed something fundamental. My shoulder burned from the recoil. My ears rang. Smoke drifted from the barrel in a pale ribbon that caught the truck's headlights. I waited for another scream, another charge, another glimpse of yellow eyes. Nothing came. Just the slow settling of leaves and the faint creak of branches returning to stillness. I stood there longer than was safe, rifle raised, heart battering my ribs. The woods felt occupied, but not moving. Watching. Measuring again. When I finally took a cautious step forward, I found disturbed earth where the man had fled, gouges in bark at shoulder height, a smear of blood across a cluster of ferns. Not a body, not a limb, just absence shaped like violence. I called out once, hating myself for it, and my voice dissolved into the trees. No answer. The metallic scent hung in the damp air, thick and intimate. I followed the trail for perhaps 20 yards before the forest changed its mind about letting me see. The blood thinned, the ground hardened. Whatever had happened beyond that point belonged to something stronger and faster than I would ever be. I stopped because I understood a truth that felt older than fear. If it wanted me dead, I would already be on the ground. That realization did not comfort me. It implicated me. I lowered the rifle slowly and backed away from the darkness until I felt the cool breath of the lake on my neck. The shoreline looked almost serene again, headlights carving long, pale paths across black water. I kept expecting the surface to break, for that towering shape to rise once more, but the lake lay flat and reflective, as if it had never given birth to anything at all. I drove home with the windows down despite the cold, trying to clear the smell from my clothes, from my skin, from my thoughts. By morning, search parties were combing the northern trail, where the man's abandoned truck had been found. His name spread through town by noon. Outsider, documentary freelancer, wildlife enthusiast. No one knew about the rope, the shallow depressions, the way he had spoken about patterns and luring. They found his camera smashed against a tree trunk. The memory card was gone. The sheriff knocked on my door again, this time with sharper questions. Had I heard a gunshot last night? I said yes. I admitted I had fired into the woods when I thought I saw a large animal near my property. That part was true enough to hold shape. He studied me for a long time, eyes tired but not foolish. "We're bringing in state wildlife," he said. "If there's a rogue bear, we'll track it." I almost laughed at the word bear. Instead, I nodded and watched him walk back to his cruiser. That evening, helicopters circled the lake. Drones buzzed low over the tree line. Dogs strained at their leashes and then refused to advance past certain invisible thresholds. I stood at my window and felt the old pull in my chest. It wasn't calling me this time. It was waiting. The first body they recovered was not from the lake, but from a ravine half a mile north. The man, or what remained. There were marks the officers could not classify. Too long for a bear, too deliberate for a random mauling. They told the town it was likely a mountain lion passing through, aggressive and starving. People clung to that explanation because it had a name. Names make terror manageable. But something changed after that. The disappearances stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Weeks passed. Then months. The lake returned to its old rhythms. Boats eased back onto the water. Children skipped stones near the dock, under watchful parental eyes. The vigils faded into anniversaries. I kept my distance. I did not fish. I did not walk the northern trail. I slept in fragments, waking at the slightest sound of rain against the roof, because it reminded me of water breaking. Sometimes, late at night, I would step onto my porch and stare toward the dark smudge of trees beyond town. On certain evenings, when the air was thick and still, I felt that pressure again between my shoulder blades. Not close, not immediate, just present, as if something vast shifted beneath the surface miles away and briefly remembered me. I replayed that moment in the woods over and over. The creature's eyes on the man, the almost word shaped like my name, the way it had hurted me to witness what he had done. I began to suspect something that unsettled me more than any claw or tooth. It had not been hunting blindly. It had been responding. Territorial, yes, but not mindless. The lake was not simply habitat. It was boundary. The man had crossed it with ropes and bait and ambition, and the thing in the water had corrected him. I do not pretend that makes it innocent. People died. A boy never came home. Blood soaked into pine needles because a creature with intelligence chose violence over retreat. But I can no longer reduce it to a monster from a campfire story either. It understood provocation. It understood being watched. It understood my name. The state eventually declared the area safe. Wildlife officers found no further evidence of a large predator. The official file closed with a paragraph about misidentified animal activity exacerbated by human interference. Life resumed its shallow grooves. I tried to follow. I went back to work. I smiled at neighbors. I attended the next town cookout and stood near the grill pretending smoke in my eyes explained the wetness there. But something in me had shifted, as surely as the mud beneath that clawed hand. I had been chosen once, spared twice, and used as a witness to a reckoning I did not fully grasp. I never returned to the lake at night again. Not because I was afraid it would kill me, because I was afraid it wouldn't. There are moments, even now, when I wake before dawn with the sensation of heat against my palm, as if I have just touched water warmer than it should be. I lie there listening to the faint hum of distant traffic and wonder if the boundary still holds. I wonder if it sleeps coiled in the depths, patient and aware, or if it has moved on to another stretch of wilderness where someone else will mistake curiosity for control. And sometimes, in the thin space between sleep and waking, I hear that low vibration again, shaping itself around the edges of my name, like a question it has not finished asking. I have never told the town the full truth, not because they wouldn't believe me, because belief would change what they are tempted to disturb. Some things in this world are not hiding, they are holding a line. And once you understand that, you realize the real horror is not that something rose from the water. It's that it knew exactly when to do it.